road, key choices to consider before you start designing your strategic planning process. We have a couple of logistics that we'd like to review before we move forward with the webinar. As you can tell, all participants are automatically muted for this webinar, and this is in order to ensure audio quality throughout the webinar. However, that does not mean that we do not want this webinar to be interactive. So if you have a question or comment that comes up as we go through the various slides, please feel free to type them in to the chat box that is located in the column on the right-hand side of the screen. If you are participating on this webinar via telephone, please make sure that you enter your audio PIN number so that when we come to the sections of the webinar where we will open up the phone lines. So just a bit more about who is hosting today's webinar. We are the Capacity for Health program, which is a capacity building assistance program at the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. Today's webinar is actually a combination of multiple projects that we have been working on here at the organization, and they include some of our work with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention around HIV-related capacity building assistance, as well as a number of different projects from various funders, including the CDC as well as the Kellogg Foundation. I believe on the line today we have representatives from our Racial Equity Initiative collaboratives. We also have representatives from our Health Through Action for Children and Families, which is funded by the Kellogg Foundation, along with the Racial Equity Initiative. And then also members from our STRIVE cohort, which is focused on physical activity, nutrition, and weight management, which is a CDC-funded initiative. There may also be participants from our OSTLS constituent base, which is the CDC Office of State, Tribal, Local, and Territorial Support. So regardless of which cohort or group you belong to and what led to your interest in today's webinar, we've received feedback from multiple sources that strategic planning is an issue, a topic area that is of increasing interest for organizations, especially as they take a look at the world around them and how it's changing, and are thinking through the different ways they can be best prepared for the future in order to ensure their organization's sustainability as well as their organization's continued effectiveness. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Ed Tepporn. I'm the Vice President for Community Strategies at the Health Forum. I'll be your presenter today. And as you see from the screen, I have over 18 years of experience in the nonprofit sector and have delivered capacity building assistance to numerous organizations across the U.S. and its territories. And it's those experiences that I hope to share with all of you. And I also encourage each of you on today's webinar to also please share some of your experiences, your lessons learned, your frustrations regarding strategic planning so that we all can collectively learn from one another. Much of today's webinar is based on the two books that you see on the screen. I want to put out there that I have no financial connection to the authors or the publishing companies, but I simply offer these two books as resources that I've found extremely helpful in my own work with organizations across the country, as well as in organizations that I've been part of, staff of. On the left-hand side of the screen is the book Strategic Planning for Nonprofit Organizations, and this is the primary resource that the content for today's webinar is adapted and drawn from. The authors of this book are Michael Allison and Jude Kay, and they are two noted consultants in the nonprofit world. On the right-hand side of the screen is a book by David LaPiana called The Nonprofit Strategy Revolution. And while I won't go into very much detail at all on today's webinar, I wanted to share this as a potential resource that some of you might find helpful, especially if you're looking for new ways of thinking about the strategic planning process. What David LaPiana puts forward in this book is perhaps a different take on how organizations might think about strategic planning and how they might implement strategic planning. Before we really dive into the content, I want to make sure that we have a chance to to review what exactly strategic planning is. And so I'd like to offer this definition, which comes out of the book Strategic Planning for Nonprofit Organizations. I won't read the definition word for word, but as you can see from this definition, in a nutshell, what strategic planning is a systematic, thoughtful process that really seeks to create agreement in an organization with the ultimate goal of establishing priorities that help an organization to inform how it will seek out as well as use resources to meet those priorities that it establishes. And so this is, I think, a helpful working definition for us to think about strategic planning, and it's the context that I'll be talking about strategic planning in the many slides to come over the next hour or so, with maybe 30 minutes at the end for some question and answer from the broader group. For those of you who are familiar or not as familiar with strategic planning, what the authors of the book, Michael Allison and Jude Kay, offer is that typically there are about 7 phases of strategic planning. And as you reflect on the strategic planning processes that you've been involved with in your own organizations, perhaps they have followed some of these different phases. Typically, the strategic planning process starts out with a time to think about how you are going to plan to engage in strategic planning, followed typically by an opportunity for an organization to reflect on its mission, vision, and values, and to whatever degree needed, potentially tweak or adapt or update those. Often there is a phase related to gathering data, whether that is conducting focus groups, conducting key informant interviews, surveys, but really it's an opportunity for an organization to reach out to its internal and external stakeholders to get their perspectives in terms of where the organization has been, where it's currently, and how it might consider moving forward. Typically, the data gathering process has a lot of information that is yielded from all of those different activities, and it's important for the organization to then sift through all of that data and establish some clear priorities based on that data. Those priorities are then typically conceptualized and concretized into a physical strategic plan document, which then in the ideal world gets implemented over the course of a year, 3 years, 5 years, and as it's being implemented, ultimately gets evaluated and monitored so that, as needed, an organization can course correct. So I want to pause here and actually take us into our first opportunity to make this webinar a little bit more interactive. We have some live polling. And so what we've done is we're going to give each of you an opportunity to respond to this question, and you'll do that by, on the next screen, indicating your one of 3 responses to this question of what level of gut reaction do the words strategic planning trigger for you? Is it option number 1, which is, I love strategic planning, let's do it? Or is it option number 2, I know it's important, but there's maybe something keeping me from it, maybe there's a lack of a specific understanding of a particular area in strategic planning, or a feeling of not having the resources. You know, there's something that might be holding us back from being completely excited. Or whether it's the third option, ugh, here we go again, 6 months worth of talking to produce another paperweight. So think about which of these 3 choices best represents your level of gut reaction, and I'm going to ask you to then indicate your response as we open the poll. So I'm going to give all of you about 30 seconds to enter in your response. So again, please take an opportunity to respond to this question. What level of gut reaction do the words strategic planning trigger for you? And select one of the 3 options that you see on your screen. And we'll close out the poll and see what the responses are. So, interestingly enough, it looks like there are some people who are excited about strategic planning on today's webinar, about 38% of you on the call. There's also folks who are excited or know it's important but think that there are some potential areas that can hopefully be clarified to help facilitate even greater excitement. And then we do have a couple of folks, 8%, who are thinking ugh. And I don't know if I will be able to change your mind by the end of this webinar, but hopefully I'll give you some continued food for thought about how to make the process perhaps more palatable. So let me review the webinar objectives for today's webinar. By the end of this workshop, online workshop or webinar, what we hope you will have is, as you can see from the first bullet point on the screen, an increased understanding of at least 5 questions you might consider as you're developing your plan to engage in strategic planning. Hopefully, folks are now able to see the screen with the webinar objectives. The second objective is an increased knowledge about the 3 levels of intensity in terms of strategic planning. Perhaps that's what's driving some of the ugh feeling, is the thought that whenever an organization engages in strategic planning, it has to be this all-hands-on-deck, time-intensive 6-month, 8-month process. And the reality is that there are actually different levels of intensity that an organization can undertake as they think about strategic planning. And then the final 2 objectives are around just hopefully an increased ability to tailor some of the best practices out in the field related to strategic planning to meet the specific needs of your organization, as well as hopefully an increased level of confidence to be able to develop and tailor that effective strategic planning process. The bulk of today's webinar is going to focus on these 10 key questions that I'll be reviewing, which I think are 10 very important questions for any organization to think about before they actually start planning to strategic plan. And so we'll start at the very beginning. I hear it's a very good place to start. And the first key question is, why are we doing this now? And that really is going to vary from organization to organization. It's probably not helpful for your organization to engage in strategic planning just for the sake of doing so. Any strategic planning process truly requires an investment of time, energy, and resources, and you want to ensure that there's much buy-in as possible into why it might be important for your organization to engage in strategic planning, as well as what you want to do as a result of that strategic planning process. I think many times organizations find themselves compelled to engage in strategic planning just because there's big picture questions to explore. Maybe you've got a fundamental change in your mission or vision or programmatic strategy. You might also engage in strategic planning because you recognize that there's some potential challenges or opportunities in your political, economic, or cultural environment. But especially for nonprofit organizations that are engaged in public health or health care, I think it is a really strategic time to engage in strategic planning, because public health and healthcare are at this series of important crossroads where the environment, even in the past 2 years, has shifted so dramatically and will continually be likely to shift, that it's important for organizations such as all of ours to be as ready as possible to be nimble and adapt to these changing environments. And some of the things that are changing in the environment are, as you see in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, the funding environment. We know that the economy hasn't completely turned around yet, and that many organizations are still struggling to find the resources to keep their programs and organization afloat. And we are all, I think, collectively experiencing challenges in regards to seeking out not only government funding, but also foundation funding and individual donor funding. A second big game changer or shift in the environment is the Affordable Care Act, which is a wonderful opportunity for our country. And as it continues to get operationalized and implemented, potentially has the ability to impact funding priorities as well as business and programmatic priorities for organizations that are involved in public health and healthcare. In the lower left-hand side of the screen, we've also seen shifting federal priorities, and much of that is due to strategic planning efforts or national planning efforts at the federal government level that are potentially shifting attention at the federal and state and local level, and concurrently are also potentially shifting resources. So some of the examples of this that we've seen are the National Prevention Strategy, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's High-Impact HIV Prevention Strategy, along with the National HIV/AIDS Strategy, as well as the Viral Hepatitis Action Plan put out by the Department of Health and Human Services. And then one final shift that I want to mention in the lower right-hand side of the screen is potentially that there are new paradigms in the various disease areas or issue areas that we might work on. So for example, for those of you on the call who are involved in HIV prevention, there is an increasing body of research that has shown the effectiveness of using antiretroviral medications as part of a biomedical prevention strategy, and this is often referred to as treatments prevention. And this paradigm is impacting how requests for proposals from federal, state, and local governments are getting issued out, and the whole business and intersection of what was previously distinctly HIV prevention versus HIV care, and now there's perhaps more overlap and gray area between the two. And I think that we're seeing similar trends in other disease areas as medical advances come forward, as new approaches to prevention and outreach education come forward. But all in all, these are all important things to consider for an organization in order to remain impactful and sustainable. And it may be important for our organizations to engage in strategic planning in order to more concertedly think about each of these or any combination of these potential shifts. I'm going to move into the second question, which is how intensive will our process be? And this gets to the second webinar objective of understanding what potentially 3 levels of intensity might look like. And the core of this question is really how much of a process can board and staff together stomach. What you'll see is that there are different options that are available to organizations. And I'll start with the most extensive option, which is the extensive work plan. So this level of intensity typically lasts 4 to 8 months. And as you see in the left-hand column that's highlighted in yellow, when you think about who's involved in an extensive work plan, it really is all hands on deck. The entire board, the entire staff, getting the perspective of clients, funders, partners. And so when I say that these folks are actively engaged in the strategic planning process, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are part of your strategic planning committee, although that's definitely an option that's open to you. But at the very least, that you are seeking the input and perspective from them, especially in regards to clients, funders, and partners. Moving into the middle column, what does an extensive work plan consist of? In a nutshell, it's a lot of meetings, discussions, and decisions. Typically, you start off with multiple planning initial meetings to think about how you're going to plan your strategic planning process. There is also usually a concerted process to identify your external stakeholders. Again, typically your clients, funders, and partners, although there's potentially others that I'll go over in future slides. And this is often followed by data gathering via surveys, focus groups, interviews, or similar strategies with those external stakeholders. Once that data is gathered, then typically there's a process of data analysis and review to identify key themes related to both the internal and the external environment. And based on those key themes, then board and staff, through a series of meetings and discussions, come together to reach agreement on which issues are the most important to focus on and which strategies will be used to reach those prioritized issues. Once that broad strategy and direction is set, then there's often even more meetings to create more specific goals and objectives, sometimes referred to as an operational plan. And then all of this work is summarized in a massive document, typically a 12 to 40 page document that gets formally approved by the board. And then once it's approved, then more meetings might happen so that staff can even more concertedly operationalize that strategic plan. So that's the how, all the different things that might happen in an extensive work plan. Finally, in terms of the what's the end product of an extensive 4 to 8 month work plan? As I mentioned, it's typically a 12 to 40 page extensive document, and then the bullet points on that right-hand yellow column detail some of the different pieces that are typically woven into as sections of that strategic planning document. An affirmation or reaffirmation of the mission, or an adaptation or edits to past mission statements, concrete identification of the strategic issues and the core strategies to address those issues, potentially concrete program goals and objectives and management operation goals and objectives. There's also usually a brief summary of the steps involved in the planning process so that there's a context to how the plan was developed, and then often many appendices indicating some of the key themes that emerged from surveys, focus groups, or any of the major retreats or meetings that might have happened to develop the plan. And then finally, that detailed operation plan is often included as one of the appendices for the strategic plan. So that's the extensive level of intensity for work plans. I'm going to review now the moderate intensity work plan, which is about a 1 to 3 month process. And when you look at who's involved in a moderate work plan compared to an extensive work plan, you'll see a couple of shifts. And those shifts depend on the size of your organization. If you consider yourself a smaller community-based organization, then perhaps it's still your entire board and entire staff that are involved in your strategic planning process, and to whatever degree is appropriate, getting either participation or input from clients. If you're a larger community-based organization, however, what we often see is that it's typically the board and then perhaps a management team of selected staff representatives as opposed to your entire staff. And key constituents involved in getting input from include your clients and funders, as you see on the bottom of that left-hand column. How it's different from an extensive work plan in terms of the types of activities involved is it's much more streamlined. While there are still several meetings, typically a moderate work plan might start off or end with 1 or 2 days of large group meetings or retreats. Those are bookended, those retreats serve as bookends to typically a series of smaller meetings of the board and staff to inform those larger group meetings or retreats. And then a lot of concerted work is actually done in planning committees with a focus on reflection on the past, analysis of current, present position, and then also thinking about those future strategies. In a moderate work plan, there is an element of data collection, either from clients or funders, but typically fewer surveys, fewer focus groups, fewer key informant interviews that compared to an extensive work plan. In terms of the final products, you notice that the strategic plan document itself is considerably shorter, only 8 to 12 pages, but many of the elements from the extensive work plan still play out here. So still an affirmation or adaptation to the mission and identification of those strategic issues. Often in a moderate work plan or moderate intensity strategic planning document, what we see are, instead of goals, perhaps long-term and short-term program and management priorities. Some organizations do take that extra step to more specifically build in program and management goals, but that, given a shortened time period, may not necessarily be the focus of all organizations who undertake a moderate work plan level of strategic planning. Similarly, data collection, because there might be less of it, there's not as much to summarize in a moderate level or moderate intensity work plan. But there is still, I think, an importance of developing an annual operating plan in terms of how to provide concrete direction for staff who are responsible for implementing those long-term or short-term program and management priorities. So that's the moderate level work plan. And again, as we go, if there's any questions that folks might have, comments, reflections on your own experiences, please feel free to type those into the chat box, and I would love to share that with everyone on today's call as well. The final level of intensity that I want to review with you is the abbreviated strategic work plan. As you can see, this is the super low intensity version of strategic planning that may last only a day or two. And in terms of who's involved, again, it depends on the size of your organization. Smaller community-based organizations, typically the entire board, entire staff. Larger community-based organizations, the entire board with perhaps sprinkling of staff representatives. What you'll notice in terms of the how, the activities in an abbreviated strategic planning retreat or strategic planning process, is that the focus is on a day-long retreat, although there is possibly some concerted time and effort put into pre-retreat planning and other data analysis or data collection. And then after the retreat, there are follow-up meetings by staff, again, typically to develop the operational plan. Because of the abbreviated process, the outcomes, the what of this level of intensity are very condensed. The strategic plan document itself is only 3 to 8 pages. There is still typically an affirmation or reaffirmation of the mission, a summary of strategies, and a list of those long-term and short-term program and management priorities. So let me pause here after reviewing those 3 levels of intensity. And I am going to open up our next interactive poll, which is going to ask you, which level of intensity is right for your organization after hearing a brief synopsis of the extensive 4 to 8 month process, the moderate 1 to 4 month process, or the abbreviated 1 day, 2 day process. So take about 20 seconds to reflect on this question and lock in your answer. And we will close the poll in about another 5 seconds. Keep in mind that this isn't Goldilocks and the 3 bears. The middle intensity may not be the just right level for your organization. But what's important for you to think about is who, how, and which level feels appropriate for your organization, what you might want out of strategic planning, how much time, energy, and resources you are willing to commit. And so looking at the poll results, it's interesting to note that no one selected the extensive process, and I think that that is in line with trends that we've seen where many organizations are moving away from that super extensive 4 to 8 month strategic planning process, and folks on this call at least are evenly split in terms of an abbreviated or moderate level intensity for your organization. So that's really interesting to note, and I'll think about that as I continue through the next couple of questions. So as I move into the next slide, the third key question we're going to consider today is who's in charge of your strategic planning process? And before I even go there, I want to do another poll. And this poll is going to ask the question, who do you think is in charge of the strategic planning process? And you have 3 choices here. The first choice is the board. The second choice is the staff. And the third choice is the board and staff together. So let's take maybe just 15 seconds to mark your response. In your gut, in your head, in your heart, who do you think is in charge of the strategic planning process? And we'll give it 5 more seconds for folks to lock in their response. And let's see what folks on this webinar think. All right, so 14% think it's the board who's in charge, 5% think it's the staff who's in charge, and 81% think it's the board and staff together who's in charge. Really interesting responses, and I am happy to share with you that actually 100% of you are right. Depending on your organization, it could be the board, it could be the staff, or it could be the board and staff together. And so over the next couple of slides, I'll give you some additional food for thought to think about for your particular organization, which might be most appropriate in terms of thinking about who's in charge of the strategic planning process. So we'll start off with a board-led approach. So in the board-led approach, where the board is in charge, typically what we think of is that strategic planning sets the broad direction and priorities for an organization. And that's why ultimately for some organizations, they choose to have the board decide to be in charge. And ultimately it's the board's decision about whether it's a board-led approach, a staff-led approach, or a board and staff-led approach. But in those organizations where the board decides that they want to keep the charge, the leadership of the strategic planning organization, in those organizations, part of the reason why board might come to this decision is that they believe that they have perhaps the broadest perspective and are maybe the most able to fly at that 30,000-foot big picture perspective to inform and lead a strategic planning process. The caveat here that I want to offer for those organizations that are considering board-led approaches is that it's important for the board to consider key points for staff input and perhaps even staff decision-making, or else there is a risk of creating a strategic plan that staff have not bought into and thus ultimately don't support moving forward. So that's one key caveat that I want to raise to those of you that are considering a board-led approach. Let's turn to the staff-led approach. This might be thought of as maybe a bottoms-up approach to strategic planning. And in organizations that pursue a staff-led approach, often the board might decide that they are delegating to staff the opportunity and responsibility to lead the process, perhaps because they feel they don't have the capacity or previous experience with strategic planning to lead the process, or perhaps there are other priorities that board members feel are more important to focus their time and energy on. There might be a fundraising or a capital campaign that is a make or break situation for the organization. Another reason that we've often seen board delegate to staff is that there might be considerable trust in either the executive director or a senior member of staff who might have previous experience conducting strategic planning, that the board feels that they want to entrust that process to a staff person. So for those of you who are considering staff-led approaches to strategic planning, there's also a couple of caveats that I would encourage you to consider. It's important in staff-led processes to ensure that there's clear agreement between the board and the staff on the process of strategic planning as well as the end products. Often, I think for those of us who are staff and community-based organizations, we can be really focused on our day-to-day deliverables and deadlines, and sometimes it can be challenging for us to step back and see the big picture. So that's potentially a second caveat to keep in mind when staff are leading the process. So because of that tendency for us to maybe focus in on the details, the programmatic details, we often tend to fly more at that 5,000-foot level in terms of perspective, not necessarily in terms of hierarchy, but in terms of focus. We're really focused on the deliverables and details of the organizations or of our program's work. Because of that tendency, in staff-led approaches, it's important for staff to also think about how they might gain that big picture perspective or include that big picture perspective in the strategic planning process. And thus, it's important to consider how they're actively involving the board in providing input or in the decision making. What we've often seen happen too in staff-led approaches is if funding is tight for your organization and you're going into a strategic planning process, there can sometimes be a tendency for staff within various programs or departments to feel like they have to use the strategic planning process to advocate for their own programs or their own jobs rather than looking at that broader organization perspective. So that's a third caveat to be sensitive to when undertaking staff-led approaches to strategic planning. So the final option is a board-staff partnership approach. And I think it was interesting to note that while this is where many of you landed, this sounds like this is the best case scenario, and I just want to reemphasize that this isn't the Goldilocks and Three Bears approach either, that this wasn't a trick question. Actually, it does depend on the unique circumstances of your organization around which approach is best for you. But for those organizations that are considering board-staff partnership approach, I would pose that this is possibly the most difficult. And the reason for this is that sometimes in organizations there's a lack of understanding from board perspective of what staff are responsible for or what staff do, and vice versa, a lack of understanding about the role of the board and their responsibilities. And unless there's that clear understanding in both directions, that dynamic can find its way into the strategic planning process. Often when we've seen organizations that engage in strategic planning where there is some level of tension or conflict between board and staff, that conflict or schism also finds its way of working and manifesting itself in the strategic planning process. So for those organizations that are considering board-staff partnership approach, the consideration is there a clear understanding of roles and responsibilities between board and staff, and what is the level of previous experience, if you will, of board and staff working together in a cohesive manner. If there isn't a prior experience in doing so, strategic planning may be an opportunity to do that, but it can also be a dangerous minefield if folks are coming together for the first time. I'm going to move into the fourth key question to consider, and that's who's leading the process. So while we might decide that the board or the staff or the board staff together are in charge, ultimately there is usually a strategic planning committee, and the head of that strategic planning committee is what we're talking about in this instance for this question. Unfortunately, strategic planning for community-based organizations can sometimes feel like a process of herding cats, as you see on the screen, as we try to navigate different perspectives, different experiences, different values and priorities. And so this question of who's leading the process is an important question for any organization to consider. What's great is that there are a number of different options that you have to consider in terms of who can lead the process, and you see that on the screen. You have either the board president, you have the board member as an option, you have the executive director as an option, and you also have the senior staff person as an option. So again, organizations often designate a strategic planning committee or task force that really does the bulk of the work involved in the strategic planning process. Sometimes that strategic planning committee might be a standing board committee or an ad hoc board committee. It could be the board's executive committee, or if it's a staff-led process, it might be the staff leadership or management team. In other cases, some organizations might convene a specific group that consists of board, staff, or some combination thereof, solely for the purpose of strategic planning. So you'll notice in the four options that consultant is not on the list, and that's not to say that you can't have a consultant involved in your strategic planning process. But if your organization chooses to hire a consultant, we'll talk about some considerations about that in just a little bit, I think it's important for there still to be complete ownership of the process by someone internal to the organization, so that that person is working in partnership with the consultant and really serves as the internal shepherd or champion for the staff. So let me just share with you a couple of factors to consider across these 4 options that you see on the screen. If you're thinking that you want the board president to serve as the primary lead, then you might want to consider whether or not she or he has the sufficient time, interest, or experience with strategic planning to do so. If you're thinking about having a board member, that second column, similarly, you'll want to make sure that they have sufficient time, interest, and experience. And in this particular option, you also want to make sure that there's clear delegation of authority from your board president to your board member, and clear processes for keeping everyone informed. In the third option, if the board thinks that the executive director is the best position and has the best skill set to lead the process, it's important to consider to what degree that executive director is already overextended. If there is too much on her or his plate, then they may not necessarily be the best person to lead the process. And then finally, in larger organizations, we sometimes see a senior staff person who isn't the executive director designated to lead the process. And typically when this happens, it's because that senior staff person has previous experience in strategic planning in other organizations or in the organization that they're part of. So just those are a couple of key considerations to think about when you are trying to decide who leads the process. Moving right along into the 5th key question to consider, who's writing the document, whether it's a 8 to 12 page document or a 12 to 40 page document. This is a critical choice for your organization. And here you also have several options. So the 3 that I want to go over first is that sometimes it's the board member, sometimes it's the executive director, sometimes it's the senior staff person. And more often than not, it's dependent on who was assigned to be leading the charge. And it's the same person, ultimately, who writes it. But this decision about who's actually going to sit down and write the plan it's important to think about to what degree that person has previous experience, writing skill, and availability in terms of specifically writing strategic plans. Sometimes the person who is leading your strategic planning process may or may not necessarily be the best person to write it. And so that's where the 4th option comes in, which is hiring a consultant to write the plan. And based on the experiences of numerous community-based organizations across the country, I do want to put forward that the option of having a consultant write your strategic plan is something that I offer as perhaps a last choice, because the significant challenge around hiring a consultant to do this is that the buy-in and ownership from both staff and from board when this plan is written by someone outside the organization can be a barrier to its endorsement, its buy-in, and the energy and momentum about moving that strategic plan forward. I'm going to move into the 6th key question to consider. And so this piece is about whether or not you want to use a consultant, whether that's for writing the plan or helping to shape the plan or helping to facilitate the plan. So for this question of to consultant or not to consultant, this actually is not necessarily a yes-no question, and there's different scales of consultant involvement if you decide that you do want to somehow incorporate a consultant into your strategic planning process. But let me start with why you might not need to have a consultant. So if you believe that your organization has strong knowledge of strategic planning processes and strong in-house facilitators, then you might find yourselves in a situation where you perhaps don't need to hire a consultant and you can do this work of managing the process as well as writing the plan internally. If you are, however, considering using a consultant, let me go over 4 different ways that consultants can be involved in the strategic planning process. In the middle of the screen, you see a blueprint, which kind of represents how a consultant can serve as an architect, if you will, for your strategic planning process. Perhaps your organization's board and staff don't have a firm grasp of strategic planning, but you have strong facilitators that could facilitate conversations and discussions, then perhaps you might hire a consultant to serve as an architect to help assist you with designing your strategic planning process. So that's one option for consultant involvement. A second option is that perhaps you have strong planning skills, you have strong experience with strategic planning, but you feel that you may not necessarily have strong facilitators, or you think you could benefit from having an outside or neutral facilitator, then you could potentially use your consultant as a referee or as a facilitator in your strategic planning process. A third option is, as you can see, you can hire Barbara Walters, not necessarily as a journalist, but in this case, you might use your consultant to help you with data collection and interviews, especially if you're engaging in an extensive process, which didn't seem that any of you on today's call were interested in, but even in a moderate level intensity strategic planning process, if you have a significant number of interviews or surveys or focus groups that you're looking to conduct, there may be an opportunity to use a consultant to help with those activities. And then finally, in the lower right-hand corner, what you see is an owl, and that owl represents the consultant serving in the role of being a subject matter expert to help influence and inform your strategic planning process. So as an example, perhaps your organization has been previously health-focused, but is now interested in exploring the educational field. You might use a consultant as a subject matter expert to help you frame the key decisions and choices as your organization expands into this new field. So regardless of any of these 5 options, obviously a big factor in whether or not you might use a consultant is the cost of using a consultant. And just as a reference, different strategic planning consultants charge different amounts. But it's not unheard of for an extensive strategic planning process to cost upwards of $30,000 or $40,000 to have a consultant engage in designing and helping to implement the process. So cost, I think, is one of the biggest factors that community-based organizations often factor in as they're making this decision around this question. I'm going to move into the 7th question, which is, will you or will you not incorporate retreats into your strategic planning process? And there are a couple of different choices that you have when it comes to retreats. Retreats can actually be a crucial part of the strategic planning process, but I think for many of us on today's webinar, being part of those retreats or helping to plan some of those retreats, there's also a recognition that there is a significant amount of planning and possibly a lot of time away from the office and actually doing our work in terms of service delivery that gets consumed when we move into day-long or 2-day-long or week-long retreats. So most of us are perhaps most familiar with strategic planning processes that kick off with a retreat, but that's not the only option that we have. So the first option is to actually start with data gathering. And sometimes an organization may feel it's important to have a better understanding of their position. So for those organizations, it perhaps might be better to actually start with data gathering so that you can get a firmer grasp of your organization's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, your environment, and trends. A second option is that perhaps your organization has already undertaken other processes. Maybe you've just completed a marketing study, a branding study, a positioning study. So you have a lot of that data that might actually inform your strategic planning process. So instead of delving into another round of data gathering, perhaps what organizations who find themselves in this situation might start off strategic planning with is strategic planning committee meetings so that you can sift through the data that your organization already has and get a sense of what's potentially missing from that data that you want to collect, and also a sense of focus for your strategic planning process. A third option is to start off with the retreat, and again, I think this is what we're most familiar with, and I think why many organizations start off with retreats is it does create this wonderful opportunity for us to have buy-in to the strategic planning process early on. It also provides an important opportunity for board and staff to help shape the big picture questions as well as the issues that will be addressed during the strategic planning process. some organizations, in lieu of starting with a retreat, actually end with a retreat. And this is particularly helpful when an organization has undertaken significant data gathering or has information from the analysis of that data that they want to share back. And if your organization started with data gathering or started with committee meetings and you didn't do an initial retreat, it's probably a good idea to end with a retreat so that you can share back and have an opportunity to collectively discuss some of the findings from that data. And then finally, the fifth option is to hold retreats at both ends of the process, both at the start as well as at the end. And this can be important for the initial buy-in as well as the buy-in for strategies moving forward. So it's important to note that these choices aren't mutually exclusive. So just because you start with data gathering doesn't mean that you can't have a retreat somewhere in your strategic planning process. Just keep in mind that the purpose of the retreat in this case is focused primarily on strategic thinking and planning as opposed to a team building retreat where you engage in perhaps trust fall exercises or similar activities. I'm going to move into the 8th question, which is will or how will you involve internal stakeholders? And so for organizations, it's important to recognize that there are typically 4 sets of internal stakeholders. There's your executive director, your staff, your board of directors, and in some cases your organization might have a community advisory board that helps to shape programming that's separate from your board of directors. And so each of these 4 levels of internal stakeholders can serve various roles in your strategic planning process, and that's represented by that central column in the middle of the screen. They might provide input into your strategic planning. They might be part of the decision-making process. You might have strong facilitators internally, either in your executive director, staff, board, or advisory board, and perhaps they are part of a facilitation team for your retreats or for your strategic planning conversations, or they might actually be that person in charge of your strategic planning process. And so ultimately, your organization needs to think about to what degree you want input as well as involvement in decision-making from each of these 4 circles of internal stakeholders. I'm going to move to the 9th question in the interest of time. And so this turns our focus externally. Will or how will you involve external stakeholders? And here, again, there are multiple external stakeholders. And for community-based organizations, typically they fall into these 6 buckets. Your clients are often the most important external stakeholder that organizations typically focus on in a strategic planning process because it's because of these clients that our organizations exist. Secondly, funders are an external stakeholder as they provide the resource engine for us to be able to provide the service to our clients and our communities. And typically these could be foundations or government entities or corporations. Individual donors might be a 3rd bucket of external stakeholders. Partner organizations, folks that you have cooperative agreements with or partnerships with, collaborators, coalition members might be an important set of external stakeholders. The 5th bucket is one that perhaps not all of us often think about involving in our strategic planning process, and these are our competitors. Who are the other organizations that are doing similar work? And it may not necessarily be about involving these competitors in being a part of our strategic planning committee, but more about getting their input or perspective around where the field is, what's the environment like. And that can sometimes be a really valuable perspective to bring into your strategic planning process. And then finally, former staff and board can potentially be another bucket of external stakeholders. And it's important here to think about the circumstances about why they are former staff and board. If it was a smooth transition out, then they might be more likely to want to come back and provide input or be involved. If it was not necessarily as much of a smooth transition, then it may be harder to pull them back in. So I had wanted to have an opportunity for us to have a chat session about how others might involve external stakeholders in your strategic planning and open the phone lines up. But I think in the interest of time, what I'd like to do is actually move into the 10th question and consideration, and then from there just move us into question and answers. And definitely as we move into question and answers, please feel free to share not only your questions, but also if you have any words of advice for your fellow webinar participants on lessons you've learned, perhaps challenges that you've encountered on any of the things that, that we've shared on today's webinar. So the 10th key question and the final question and content area for today's webinar is will or how will you keep stakeholders informed moving forward? And just very briefly, what I want to offer is that in terms of keeping your stakeholders informed, whether they're internal or external, so many times, whether it's strategic planning or whether it's conducting a community assessment, our tendency as community-based organizations is to ask and ask and ask and take and take and take that data and input and perspective and opinions, and they're so valuable to us. But what we often forget to do is to then reflect back what happens with that data. What are the decisions that get influenced by that data? And so I would strongly suggest that it's important to send at least an executive summary, perhaps not your entire strategic plan, because there could potentially be some sensitive information in that strategic plan, but at least an executive summary to your external stakeholders who participated in your data gathering. It might also be important to have some sort of celebration for your planning committee, especially if you've had a moderate or extensive planning process. So often in community-based organizations, we fail to celebrate our accomplishments, and then it just leaves a bad taste in our mouth for when we have to go through those processes again in the future. So consider hosting some sort of celebration. It doesn't have to be a ball, but something to recognize and mark and acknowledge your strategic planning committee for their hard effort over the weeks and months they contributed to the process. And so again, a question here would have been, how do you keep stakeholders informed as you move through and complete your strategic planning process? So that really brings us to the close of the content piece for the 10 key questions that I wanted to share with you on today's webinar. And hopefully at least 5 of those hit that first objective of being 5 areas that you were interested in learning more about or could potentially think about tailoring, adapting for your organization. But what I want to do now is to move us into question and answer, and we'll have maybe about half an hour for this portion of the webinar. So you have 2 options for how you can raise a question or for how you can share a comment or feedback or lessons learned. You can either raise your hand, and then my colleague Vanessa will help to unmute your line, or you can type your question into the chat box, and I will help to read that question aloud or that comment aloud for you. So at this time, please feel free to share your own perspectives, your comments, your feedbacks, or to ask any questions you might have about the questions that I've posed to you to consider. So again, feel free to either raise your hand and your line will be unmuted, or you can type your question into the chat box. All right, it looks like there is a question coming in. So the question is, how often is a plan written by a consultant? And so the reality of that is I don't have a percentage to give to you. But again, the challenge around having your plan written by a consultant is that it often creates the sense that the the plan was written in isolation from board and staff. So a couple of words of advice if you do decide to have a consultant write your plan. But again, that's the last choice I really would suggest in terms of options for writing the plan. But if you do find yourselves in that situation, then it is important for that consultant to stay in regular contact with your board and staff, perhaps through your strategic planning committee, to, at various points through the strategic planning process, pause and bookend and reflect back. What are the key trends, the key themes, the key decisions that are made, either from your data gathering process or your priority setting process, so that you don't start off with a retreat and then 6 months later this plan magically appears. But as the consultant goes through the process of writing that plan, perhaps they can share an outline of what the strategic planning document is going to contain, so that there aren't any false expectations or unrealistic expectations of what's going to get included. Perhaps it's important for that consultant to share back some of the key themes that they are trying to weave into the various sections of that outline. It might be important for the consultant to have an opportunity to present back at either your staff meetings or your board meetings or your strategic planning committee meetings what their progress is in initial drafts of the strategic plan. So clarity of process, clear expectations of what the consultant is responsible for delivering, and constant regular communication throughout the strategic planning process are just some words of advice that I'd like to share for those who think that they might want to use a consultant for the writing process. So, Sarah, I believe you raised your hand to ask a question, but unfortunately you are on the phone and you need to enter in your audio PIN so that we can unmute your line. So if you can take a moment to do that, and we'll come back to your question. But in the meantime, I believe we have a question from Jennifer. So we are going to unmute your line, Jennifer. And we're still waiting to hear from Jennifer. All right, so let me read out Jennifer's question instead. So Jennifer said that I had hoped this webinar would address specific content issues for AIDS agencies that must chart a path in a new future under the ACA. Do you know of resources? So Jennifer, yes, definitely in response. So this webinar was intended to be more of a questions to consider before you engage in strategic planning, as opposed to the questions you want to consider during strategic planning in terms of future directions. For AIDS organizations in particular, whether it's ACA, whether it's community high-impact HIV prevention, or whether it's treatment as prevention, there are a number of game changers for AIDS organizations, and we are in the process of taking one of our former workshops that we've conducted at the U.S. Conference on AIDS and turning it into a webinar that I think will address some of these big picture questions that AIDS organizations will want to explore in terms of trends or shifts in the environment. It's likely that that webinar is not going to happen until perhaps January or February of 2014. So if this is a more urgent need for you, or you would like to just touch base briefly with one of our staff, and this goes for anyone else on the call as well, what I encourage you to do is to send us an email to perhaps Vanessa is the best person to do that. And so Vanessa's email address is V as in Victor, L as in Larry, A as in Apple, U as in umbrella, R as in railroad, E as in elephant, L as in Larry, at apihf.org. So vlaurel@apiahf.org. So Jennifer and others who are interested in this particular topic area, please stay tuned for some of those strategy questions that AIDS organizations might want to consider. And if you are interested in having even brief conversations with a member of our team before that webinar, we're happy to make ourselves available to you. And thank you to Vanessa for typing her email into that chat box in case folks do want to take the opportunity to maybe have some brief conversations with our team. Thanks for your questions, everyone. So we still have a little bit more time for any questions that folks might have. Again, feel free to either raise your hand and your line will be unmuted, or you can type your question into the chat box. Okay. So there is a question. There are a couple more questions that have come in. Let me see how those look. How often do you need to check back on your strategic plan? So that question, how often do you need to check back on your strategic plan, really varies on the scope and scale of your strategic plan. If you look at that first resource that I shared with you, Strategic Planning for Nonprofit Organizations, especially if you're doing a moderate or extensive strategic plan, and that strategic plan is meant to encompass maybe a 3 to 5 year planning period, it might be important on an annual basis to just check in about your progress more formally. Perhaps you have an annual retreat that happens, and to assess your progress on your strategic plan. And that, I think, is what, at the baseline, it would be the recommendation. An even better option is to weave in conversations around your progress on your strategic plan into your program meetings, into your staff meetings, and into your board meetings, so that on a more regular basis throughout the year, you have an opportunity to really track and monitor how things are evolving and how you're progressing related to your strategic plan. I also want to put out there that in that second resource that I mentioned, the Nonprofit Strategy Revolution by David LaPiana, he actually describes a different way of thinking about strategic planning, where it's not necessarily the end product being this final end-all, be-all 3 to 5 year planning document, but the result of the strategic planning process being more of a honing of what your competitive advantage and place in the environment, your niche in the environment might be, and a set of key guiding questions that he calls a strategy screen that you would ask yourself before you consider undertaking or re-undertaking a program or initiative or strategy. And in real-time strategic planning, that opportunity to think about those big picture questions and course correct and think and course correct is potentially much more often than the strategic planning process that's outlined by Michael Allison and Jude Kay in their book. So we have another question, which is, we are a smaller department that is part of a much larger organization. What sorts of resources are available to individual departments who want to become more strategic in their planning process to meet grant goals in a shorter, more time-limited window period? And thank you for that question, and that comes from Angel. Angel and others who are interested in this particular question, yes, I think that the trend is that many community-based organizations are becoming larger and larger, and the level of strategic planning at those larger organizations may not necessarily happen frequently enough for smaller departments and programs to be nimble or remain on the cusp of their field. And so in those cases, I would frame it in the context of not necessarily strategic planning, but maybe strategic thinking. And there's another wonderful resource out there called Playing to Win, which is also by David LaPiana. And in this book, what David LaPiana puts forward for organizations is a series of questions that an organization to think about what it was that they, or programs, excuse me, a set of questions that programs or departments might consider in terms of what it was that they originally set out to do, an assessment of how well they've actually accomplished, or how did they stray from what they set out to do, and sometimes there are very good reasons for why things might have changed or evolved. A opportunity to connect with external stakeholders, competitors, collaborators, to assess trends, as well as to, more importantly, actually identify what is it that makes your organization, your department, your program unique from others that are out there, and how do you continue to hone and leverage that uniqueness to essentially compete or collaborate better with other organizations, either for funding, for clients, for resources, for staff even. And so it does put forward this element of competition as opposed to collaboration, but I think that the questions that it poses from a strategic thinking perspective, whether you are competitively focused or whether you're collaboratively focused, are key questions that a department or a program could explore in order to help shape your organization's, your program's, your department's future. So we have just a little bit more time for questions. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and take us to the last slide of today's webinar. And in doing so, I want to thank all of you for your participation on today's webinar. We hope that you found it helpful in terms of an understanding of some of those key design questions that you would need to consider as you're designing your strategic planning process, that you have a better understanding of maybe an appropriate intensity level for your community-based organization, as well as some skills and confidence to potentially tailor and adapt some of the best thinking around strategic planning for your organization. There are a number of topic areas and other resources that we have related to strategic planning, as well as other organizational infrastructure and program sustainability topic areas that are available on our website, which, as you can see from the screen, is library.capacity4health.org. This website was developed out of our HIV CDC funding, so much of the information on this website is geared towards AIDS service organizations, but I think that much of the information is applicable to organizations regardless of what disease or public health, healthcare service interest area you are focused in, especially for those resources that are in the organizational infrastructure and program sustainability page of our website. We also have a set of resources related to evidence-based interventions and public health strategies, as well as a set of resources related to monitoring and evaluation. And it's on this website that we are going to post the recording of this webinar as well as the slides. So if you want to share the recording or slides with others in your organization to help share the wisdom, please feel free to do that.